2034, which is the current projection, it is solvent going forward forever into perpetuity, and it will always ensure that no member of the elderly or no one who's disabled doesn't have that income. And Social Security is particularly important to me because I'm probably the only candidate that you'll speak to who's actually lived off of Social Security. When I was 16 years old, my father had an aneurysm in his brain, and I was with him. He was permanently disabled from that point forward. And if it had not been for Social Security disability income, quite frankly, I would never have made it to college, right? It was that plus my waiting tables at TGI Fridays and my mom working hard as a teacher that got us through, that allowed us to keep our house. So I know how important Social Security is to those who become disabled or to senior citizens.
Shawn, would you support means testing or possibly raising the age of eligibility, the age of retirement?
I don't think that we need to do that. I don't think that we need to do means testing. My concern about means testing is Social Security is an insurance program, right? You pay into it, you get out of it. If you're successful, you should not get out of it just because you were successful. Similarly, I don't want to raise the retirement age. If people want to work beyond Social Security or beyond Social Security age, I'm open to adjusting the tax code to allow them to earn more before their benefits start getting cut. But I don't think that we need to raise the retirement age. I mean, the fact of the matter is that millennials last year surpassed baby boomers as the largest generation in America. And as we get them into better paying jobs, this problem is going to correct itself generationally as long as we make sure that in an economically smart way that wages are where they should be. And I'm not calling for some radical left-wing increase in the minimum wage, right? If we just adjusted the minimum wage from 1968 to today, according to inflation, it would be about $11.50. My proposal doesn't even increase it until 2018, and when it increases it from $7.25 to $8.75. So I'm not calling for radical increases. Very incremental tax credits, which are a huge benefit to businesses because it's right off the bottom line of their tax bill. And this is all spelt out on my website. It's my first bill that I'll introduce on my first day in Congress. You can find all the footnotes, everything there at Shawn, ShawnForNH.com.
One of the biggest issues of New Hampshire that we've heard all year long is the opiate crisis. How would your approach differ from Frank Kinta's or Carol Shea Porter's?
Yeah, so I think that what we need to do, I've talked to a lot of experts in the field, healthcare professionals, mental health counselors, addiction counselors, many of whom are in recovery themselves. And the first thing they tell me is that 30 days is simply not enough. You can't recover and really kick a heroin addiction or fentanyl from being inpatient for only 30 days. And we see that with notorious cases of people dying after they had been in treatment. So my plan right now, every dollar that we send to Washington, we only get 72 cents back. Other states who've had more effective representation get $1.10, $1.20 back. So we need someone who's going to go and fight for New Hampshire, someone who understands how economics and business works and who's going to go fight for New Hampshire. So I'm going to fight for an appropriation where New Hampshire would be a pilot program because we are the epicenter of this epidemic. And what I believe, after talking to experts, is that we need 90 days of inpatient care, and we need to work in a public-private nonprofit partnership to make sure that there are beds for everyone who wants a bed in New Hampshire to get 90 days of inpatient treatment followed by 6 to 12 months of outpatient follow-up, because that is what the healthcare professionals tell us it takes to kick this addiction. So while I credit Congressman Ginta for making some progress on this, we haven't made enough. Another thing that my bill would do is, we get the appropriation from the federal government, but that doesn't mean the money is getting to the people who need it. And we saw how in Concord there were fights over how to spend this money between the governor and the legislature. What I would put in the appropriation is a 90-day requirement that the money must be allocated by the state within 90 days of the appropriation. So that puts a timeline and restricts the amount of time that this can be held up in Concord, because this is a serious problem. We've lost 1,000 people in the last 2 years, and we need to get this money right away. And then, we're a small state. The federal government can try this program here, which I'm confident will work. It'll immediately save, another 1,000 or 2,000 or more citizens in New Hampshire, but it also then becomes a model that can be rolled out in other states that are subsequently suffering from this crisis. But we were the epicenter. It's, we were one of the first states impacted, and I think we make a perfect state for a pilot program. I think that what has happened is the federal government got good at cracking down on doctors prescribing painkillers and opiates to individuals, and there was an ease of getting heroin into New Hampshire from neighboring states, particularly from Massachusetts. It's relatively cheap drug to use, and so as a result of that, I think that's why we saw it happening here. People who had been addicted to prescription opiates couldn't get those anymore, and so then they sought a cheap way to get opiates, and the cheapest way was heroin or fentanyl, and so it came in to the state, and we've always had, because of our geographic location and our climate, we've always had troubles, for example, with alcoholism among young people, right? We've always been in sort of the top 3 states, in that as well. And so I think that it's a similar reason that we face this crisis with the opioid epidemic here today.
I'd like to circle back to your Social Security plan, the minimum wage. Our Voters First Forum is co-sponsored by AARP of New Hampshire, and they care very much about this. So you would raise the minimum wage incrementally, give a tax credit to small businesses to offset the cost of their higher wages.
50%. So,
okay.
Of course, a small business gets to deduct all of their wages, right? But in addition to that, so they would already get to deduct that higher wage. But in addition, what I would do is give for each increase, so the first increase is $1.50 in 2018, I would give a 50% tax credit, so 75 cents, that would go to employers that have 100 or fewer employees, because those are the ones who might have to let someone go with an increase in the minimum wage. And so this makes it a sustainable, business-friendly plan that's also going to raise millions out of poverty and help to secure Social Security.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm trying to get at. So this incremental increase in the minimum wage, which won't affect most people, because most people don't make minimum wage, you're saying that the FICA payments on that increase in wages is going to be enough to make Social Security viable?
Yes. So right now, I would end my minimum wage increase in 2022. Okay. At that point, no one in the country would be making less than $31,200. Currently, over 50% of the country makes less than $31,200. So when you increase 50% of the people's wages in this country, that generates a huge increase in the amount of FICA payments. The deficit in Social Security right now is only $68 million. My increase, by the time we get to 2022, it's going to be $300 billion in additional FICA taxes paid without any increase in rates, because we're lifting up all of those people who fall into about 52% fall under that $31,200 threshold, which is where I eventually want to get the minimum wage income to be for someone who works 40 hours a week.
And you're just assuming anybody that's below that level is going to have their wages raised to that level, and it's not going to have any effect on employment?
Well, I think that since we're giving a small business tax credit at each point along the way, small businesses are not going to have to cut people, and most large businesses, like Target, for example, are already paying significantly above the minimum wage. In my first year, none of the major corporations who've already taken publicity hits on this would even be affected, because Target and McDonald's, they've all been forced to pay like $9 an hour at a minimum because of public pressure.
Aren't they forced to do that because of market, not public pressure? They
No.
need to get employees, so they pay them more.
No, I think that a lot of it has been public pressure, because people were really upset about corporations like Walmart and Target not shut, and they were vehemently protesting that. And I think that McDonald's and Target and Walmart made the decision that it was worth it to pay employers more because it's a relatively low cost to them. And so, the other thing that we're not taking into consideration is when you give additional income to the lowest income individuals in the country, they spend all of that, right? They're not sticking that away in the stock market because they can't, right? They're living paycheck to paycheck. And so there will be an increase in consumer spending, according to economists, in my plan, by the fifth year of $200 billion of additional consumer spending. So there won't be loss in jobs, because what's going to happen is people get this additional money, right, that they get from the minimum wage increase, and they spend it. They go out and they go back to those same stores that now are paying a slightly higher wage, and they can pay a little bit more for things, and they can buy more of things, and that is going to generate a stimulus in the economy, right? What is, I think, accepted economic fact at this point is that when you stimulate the bottom of the economy, that leads to more consumer spending. And we saw that, for example, when we gave tax credits to the lower end of the economic spectrum, they went out and that helped us minimize the impact of our economic recession versus those of other countries, is that we were putting money back in the hands of people. I also have a tax plan that's going to cut taxes for anyone who makes $75,000 or less. So right now, what I want to do is, so if you make up to $37,000, I want to cut your taxes to zero. Right now, you pay about 10%, depending on where you make, and that is somewhere between 10 and 15%. I want to cut that to zero. Okay. And then anybody who makes $75,000 or less, that first $37,000 would be at the zero rate, because I believe that when you put money into the hands of consumers, they go out and spend that money, and that drives demand. And then I want to work to keep jobs here in the U.S. and keep profits here in the U.S., which is another important issue.
Are you talking about completely changing the different brackets, the tax brackets? Or are you talking about a scheme of deductions and?
No, I just want to change the lower two tax brackets, instead of it being 10 and 15 to zero, because those folks still pay, half of Social Security, they pay Medicare, they pay, not in New Hampshire, state taxes, but they're paying property taxes, which are very high here, so they're paying taxes. But I don't think that we need to, the amount of money that comes in from those taxes is relatively low. And I think that there are ways that, we can make up for that tax revenue and grow the economy. I think the way out of these crises is to grow the economy. As a business person, that's the background I come from. My business grew from nothing into a very substantial business because we provided good service at a fair price. And I think that that's what we need to do. We need to stimulate the economy so that folks are able to afford more. Everybody can, and people say, oh, this is going to cost jobs. There's no evidence that increasing it by $1.50 2 years from now with a 75-cent credit for small businesses is going to cost jobs. Inflation is basically between 0 and 2% right now. I would have a clause that would slow down the incremental growth if inflation took off. There's no signs of that, right? I mean, we're basically at 1% growth. There's no signs in the CPI of any significant inflation on the horizon. But I think that this is a plan that makes sense and it helps everyone. Wealthier folks will do better because their stocks will go up because their companies that they're investing in make more money. But those at the lower end of the spectrum will be able to afford more for their families. So I think this is, you're never going to hear this from the two parties, because Carol Shea Porter has taken $2 million in PAC money, even though she's deceived the people of this state about it for 10 years by saying she doesn't take corporate PAC money, but she whispers corporate, and everybody thinks she doesn't take any PAC money. But she's taken over $2 million in PAC money. Frank Gint has taken over $2 million in PAC money. He's taken PAC money from banks like Wells Fargo that don't even have a branch in New Hampshire. I don't know who, I guess we know who his master is. I'm not going to take any PAC money, no special interest money, no party committee money, so that I can always put New Hampshire first.
Speaking of parties, where do you stand now? You've threatened to sue the New Hampshire Democratic Party for allegations that were really unusual this past February and the spring. You threatened you were going to sue. You promised that there was going to be litigation. Where is that litigation, and on what grounds are you making these threats?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I'm focused on this election and winning this election, being of service to the people of New Hampshire, not lawsuits, okay? Certainly I believe that I was not, just like Bernie Sanders, I was not given a fair deal in the primary. I was told not to run in the Democratic primary. I was not invited to the state party convention. I was not invited to other events that every other candidate in the primary got to go to. I think that's wrong, and I think that there will be a time to hold the party accountable for that, because I believe in holding politicians accountable. But the time for that is not now, because we have to choose a new member of Congress, and the important thing is that voters get to hear folks on the issues, and they get to see the difference between, really I see this as a choice between two options. You can go back to and stay with the back and forth.
However, you made some pretty serious allegations, and some would say outlandish allegations. Shouldn't you address this now? Don't the voters deserve to know what you're talking about?
Well, I mean, I think I've addressed them. What other allegations would,
Why would you sue the New Hampshire Democratic Party?
Because they violated their own party constitution, which represents a contract, right? The DCCC emails that have been let out by WikiLeaks show that Ray Buckley, who is under the state constitution of the Democratic Party, he is required to remain neutral in a party primary. WikiLeaks shows that he was not. He was coordinating with the DCCC to get candidates that he wanted into office. And he was excluding me from events. And I'm not going to roll over like Bernie Sanders did, okay? The fact of the matter is there will be a time and a place to address this. But I think that I've answered this question, which is they excluded me from events. They told me I couldn't run. They, didn't let me participate in the state convention that every other Democrat got to participate in. That's wrong, and it's against their own constitution.
You seem eminently qualified. You have a good backstory. You're well spoken. You're seemingly willing to spend your own money on this race.
Yes.
Where was the beef with Ray Buckley? Why did he not allow you into these events? And
Ray has his own plan for who he wants to be in certain offices, and he feels that he should dictate that. I feel that the people should dictate that, and that was a fundamental disagreement that we had. But the fact of the matter is that, I have no intention of litigating this issue now, but I do believe in holding politicians of both parties accountable, and there will be a time and a place for that. I'm happy to answer questions about it, but there's not going to be any litigation ahead of this election because I think that this election is too important to let litigation muck things up.
So he just said, I'm Ray Buckley, and I get to decide who's running here, and Shawn O'Connor's not on the list.
He took me to the Bedford Village. Well, I should say I took him because I paid the bill. But, we were at the Bedford Village Inn with him, Sean Doyle, and Colin Pio, who at the time was the finance director. Sean Doyle is the executive director. And I was told specifically not to run for this office.
Why? Did they say why?
No. They just said that they didn't think that I was the best candidate and that I shouldn't run. I mean, if you notice, there aren't many primaries on the Democratic side. There's a reason for that. Right. And so, I had my own resources and my own capabilities. I had worked in Congress before. I have, friends on both sides of the aisle, both here in New Hampshire and in Washington. And I basically said to him, you can't tell me what to do. I am a U.S. citizen. I believe, as you said, I'm eminently qualified, and so I'm not going to let you dictate. But, quite frankly, I think that Ray Buckley's decision was the best thing that ever happened to me because it allowed me to be completely independent, and to put forward common sense plans that are going to work for the people in New Hampshire. Because over and over and over again, this district has been forced into this hyper-partisan debate. And I'm not going to participate in that hyper-partisan debate. I expect to be in all the debates, but I'm going to be the voice of reason in those debates, right? So Frank's going to want to privatize Social Security. He's going to want to, turn Medicare into a voucher program. Carol Shea Porter has never met a tax increase she doesn't like, right? I'm going to say, no, right? Millennials are growing. If we get wages up, if we generate economic growth, we can grow our way out of this problem. Okay? We don't need to raise taxes. We do need to make sure that we keep our solemn promise to recipients of Social Security and Medicare, and as someone who benefited from Social Security, that promise means more to me than to anyone else. We have to keep that promise, but we have to be thoughtful about how we do that and not fall into this trap of, they both vote with their party 95% of the time. I can tell you, I'm not going to vote with any party 95% of the time because I don't agree with either party 95% of the time.
After that dinner with Ray and Sean and Colin Pio, there were some allegations. You made some allegations that either the Democratic Party or Carol Shea Porter, I don't exactly remember, were spreading rumors about you.
Yes.
Can you tell us what that was all about?
Sure. So Carol Shea Porter and her campaign, and we have this well documented, and again, there will be a time and a place to hold her accountable for her actions because I find them, quite frankly, absolutely deplorable. But the time is not now because we have an important election to select the next congressperson in this district. So Carol Shea Porter and her team, went out and spread, particularly in the Seacoast, and we have witness after witness after witness, that I was a perpetrator of domestic violence. And that is an absolute lie, and we have records. I was taken by ambulance to CMC. I was in CMC for 7 hours. They thought I had a punctured spleen and that they were going to have to do emergency surgery. They did numerous tests on me. I have over 20 pages of medical records. I have an affidavit from the perpetrator, that person was a perpetrator, I was not, She spread this and continued to spread this, and her tentacles of her campaign, people who, David Pierce is on the record, former state senator from Hanover, of saying that Bob Perry, who has been a stalwart of the inner circle of Carol Shea Porter for 10 years, told him that I was a perpetrator of domestic violence. This also occurred at a Barrington Democrats meeting. It happened at other Democratic meetings on the Seacoast. And there will be a time and a place because I will not let this go, because if I let this go, what happens is that domestic violence survivors will then have to fear that their being a survivor of domestic violence will disallow them to run for office because it could be turned on its head against them. And that is absolutely unacceptable in our democracy. It is as bad as what Donald Trump did on this horrendous videotape. And so I'm not going to stand for that, but the people need to make a choice about who they're going to vote for in 28 days. Mucking that up with lawsuits right now is not something that makes sense.
And so when we originally heard about some of these allegations, we asked the Bedford Police Department, can you confirm something? Do you have any records? And we did a right to know request for some of these calls, and so we can see that. I mean, there's a transport to CMC Hospital in 2013. There was a domestic violence investigation. Is that what this?
Yes.
That's what all of this is?
Yes. And as you can see, the Bedford Police Department is confirming exactly what I said, that I was transported to CMC, that it was an issue of domestic violence. I chose not to press charges, which is my right. Everybody has that right. And what is really disturbing and sad about this is, quite frankly, Carol Shea Porter has been an ally of the LGBT community. And she has voted with the LGBT community a lot. But there is no doubt that she never would have tried such a desperate attempt to grab onto power if this was a woman who had been abused by a man. Okay? She never would have done that. But she thought she could get away with this because I happen to be an LGBT man. And that is unacceptable. That is not what live free or die means, right? I am proud that we were the first state to pass marriage equality legislatively rather than through the courts. And this is a decided issue in this state. If you look at the polling, 70% of people say that they support marriage equality. And for her to stoop to this level, as David Pierce said, nobody should take the lowest of roads to one of the highest offices in Washington. And so, that's just unacceptable to me, okay? And I have decided that I'm not going to make this election about that, right? I could have sued them all and made this whole election about lawsuits. I decided not to do that because I believe I have a positive vision to offer that is very different from the vision that has been offered by the two of them for 10 years as they have traded this seat back and forth and back and forth. Both of them have enriched themselves enormously. Carol Shea Porter has made over $1 million of our tax dollars in Washington. And all she achieved was that she passed 9 symbolic House resolutions to do things like name post offices. And she was in the majority for 4 of those 6 years. That is a horrendous record of ineffectiveness. That is unacceptable. We deserve better. We're New Hampshire. Everybody in the House and the Senate, they think they're going to be president. They should be coming to us, right? You have a tremendous opportunity to be a leader when you are from New Hampshire in the United States House of Representatives. And neither Frank Ginta nor Carol Shea Porter have done that. They have not been leaders for New Hampshire. And I will be a leader for New Hampshire, and I'm willing to put my money where my mouth is, right? I have invested about $1 million into this campaign of my own money. Okay? And while I did well in my business, let it be clear, I am no Mark Zuckerberg or anywhere near it, okay? I sold this company for a fair amount of money. I paid a lot of tax on it. I'm happy to release my tax records, unlike Donald Trump. But I did not make hundreds of millions of dollars, okay? So what I'm investing is a significant portion of my savings. And the reason I'm willing to do this is this country is in trouble and this district is in trouble.
We have a million issues we could talk all day. You said you'd release your tax records. Will you? And do you think Congressman Ginta should release his tax returns as well?
I think everybody should be willing to release their tax returns. I'm happy to release mine, and I think he should release his.
So are you voting for Hillary Clinton?
I am not endorsing anyone. I haven't decided who I'm voting for president. I haven't decided who I'm voting for any other office. I am so busy with this campaign. This is a grassroots campaign. We don't have a huge political machine behind us to get out the vote. But, I will make that choice in the ballot booth myself. As you know, I supported Bernie in the primary because he understands, as I understand, that the system is rigged, that as long as all this dirty money, from whether it's from the left or the right, this dirty money influences our politicians, we cannot have people who fight for New Hampshire. And that's why I'm going to work for the minimum wage salary of $15,600.
Earlier you said Senator Sanders rolled over. What should he have done?
I think that
he lost fair and square.
Well, I don't know that he lost fair and square, right? Some of the WikiLeaks from the DNC, and Deborah Wasserman Schultz had to step down over this, suggests that the DNC was, at least putting a finger on the scales. There has been a Stanford University study that suggests that in states where they had paper ballots, he won. In states that had computerized voting, he lost, and that the chances statistically of there being this difference is, minuscule. So I'm not sure that he lost fair and square. I don't know, but what I do know is that's an open question. I don't think we can say he lost fair and square.
Dr. Jill Stein as a candidate?
I think that, I have a lot of respect for Jill Stein. At the end of the day, I'm going to assess all of the candidates. I don't agree with any of them on anything. There are things I agree with Gary Johnson on. There are things that I agree with Hillary Clinton on. There are things that I agree with Jill Stein on. There's one thing I agree with Donald Trump on, and that's that we need to address the corporate tax rate in America because it's making us uncompetitive in the rest of the world, and we need to lower that rate dramatically. So there's something that I agree with every candidate on. I honestly have not made a decision of who I'm going to vote for. From the Bernie movement, I have a lot of friends who are supporting Hillary. I have a lot of friends who are leading the Jill Stein movement. But I didn't support Bernie because I agreed with every one of his policies. Okay? I supported Bernie because I thought that he was an honorable figure who understood that the system is rigged. And I believe that the system is rigged as well. And that's what I want to fight against. And that's why I'm willing to give back voters $160,000 of my salary every year donated to New Hampshire charities of the people's choice, because it's the people's money. You shouldn't go to Washington to enrich yourself. And one of the other bills that I will introduce on my first day that's on my website is to lower the congressional salary to the average American salary. There's no reason that members of Congress should be worse off or better off than the average American. They get their travel paid for. They get their offices paid for. They get lots of meals paid for. There's no reason that you need to make $200,000 in the United States Congress. It's just not necessary. Speaker Ryan sleeps in his office. I intend to sleep in my office. There's, thanks to Frank Ginta, who voted in favor of the gym and the beauty salon and the barbershop and all those things, we have a very nice gym where you can shower and be completely hygienic. You only spend about 100 nights a year in Washington. I'm not going to pay for a plush apartment in Washington. Why do I need to do that, right? This is not what our founding fathers envisioned. I think if George Washington showed up, he would be aghast at what's going on in Washington today.
Just going back, do you think that there's a possibility that someone tampered with the electronic voting results? And if so, who?
Yeah, I have no idea. All I know is that I read a Stanford report that looked at states with paper ballots versus computer ballots. And they found that in states with paper ballots, Bernie won heavily, and in states with computer voting, that Bernie did not. And they found that the statistical probability, even taking into effect the demographics of the different states of this happening, was extremely low. I am not some sort of, conspiracy theorist. All I'm saying is I disagree with the assertion that we can say definitively that Bernie lost fair and square. I think that, Bernie really doesn't want Donald Trump to be president, and I think after the last 72 hours, a lot of us can see why he would feel that way. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think if you got him in a room by himself, and I've been in a room by himself with him on a number of occasions, that he would say he lost fair and square. I mean, I think that there are open questions from WikiLeaks. I mean, Deborah Wasserman Schultz wouldn't have had to step down as head of the DNC, if there was not something to this story. So I don't want to, I don't have enough information to make any sort of accusation. I'm just saying to say he lost fair and square, I think is not something that I think has been proven fact.
Is there one policy position that you think where you agree with Frank Ginta? And I'll ask a second part to that question. Is there one policy position where you disagree with Carol Shea Porter? So where do you agree with Ginta? Where do you disagree with Carol Shea Porter?
Yeah, so I think that the Carol legislation that Ginta passed on opioids was a good first step. I think forming the task force on opioids was a good first step, so I agree with that. I think we need to take that a lot further, and I've outlined my plans to address the opioid epidemic. So that would be something that I would agree with him on. In terms of the things that I would disagree with both of them on, but particularly Carol Shea Porter, is she has voted to keep her own salary during the government shutdown when postal workers who make $30,000 a year were furloughed and weren't being paid. I think that is just absolutely unacceptable. That is putting personal enrichment ahead of service. And, Frank Ginta voted to keep his salary even though he voted to cut soldiers' salaries or to, if there was a shutdown, that non-essential soldiers wouldn't get paid. I don't agree with either of them on that. I think that that's absolutely despicable. And what I will say is that, if there is ever a government shutdown, I will put everyone else first in line and take my very minuscule salary lasts, because I just think we got to put service back into public service, right? We need someone in this district who is going to change this decade-long disaster that we've endured, and I believe that I'm the candidate best fit to do that.
You've got experience living and working in South America, part of the world that Congress and frankly the American people don't think a lot about. What are America's interests right now in the rest of the Western Hemisphere?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we need is fair trade, not completely free trade. So I have concerns about any trade agreement that puts, sort of opens the door without agreeing on environmental regulations and labor regulations, because then it's not fair.
Are you talking specifically about the Trans-Pacific Partnership that includes a couple of South American countries?
Yeah, that as well as NAFTA. In both of those cases, in NAFTA, they just kicked environmental and labor regulations sort of down the pike, and we never got around to them. So we have free trade, but we don't have we're not competing on an equal playing field. And on TPP, we sort of designate the setting of environmental and labor standards to multilateral committees on which the U.S. only has one vote. And so what I want to make sure is that trade pacts don't end up being a race to the bottom, but rather that the U.S., which I view as, the shining city on the hill, that we raise the rest of the world up rather than dragging ourselves down to their level. Now, what I think is interesting is that Latin America and the rest of the Western Hemisphere could represent an enormous trading bloc for the United States, right? We have many, many Spanish speakers in this country, so we can easily work and communicate with Latin America. Though Brazil has had some hiccups, it's obviously a burgeoning, emerging economy that has a growing middle class. Yes, it's had some economic hiccups over the last year or two. They've had the presidential issue, but it is a strong economy. Chile is a very strong economy, and so we should look to engage those countries in more trade because, at the end of the day, the way that I see the geopolitical and economic structure developing is that, it's going to be the U.S. and China, right? If the last century was about the U.S. and Russia, the next century is going to be about the U.S. and China. And the TPP, the good thing about the TPP was that it was an attempt to make inroads into Asia, except China, so that we would be able to also play in that sphere and not allow China to sort of totally dominate the economics of Asia. But we have a much easier and closer opportunity with Latin America, where salaries are much higher than in many of the countries that are in TPP in Asia. So I think that there's enormous opportunity in Latin America. We've seen since the 1970s, the removal of most of the dictatorships. Stability has come to most of the countries. Argentina is an exception. They're the only country to have defaulted on their debt twice. But there is enormous stability and opportunity in Latin America. What will also help with sort of the immigration tide is if we can help create middle classes through trade in these countries, there's going to be less attempts to enter our country in an undocumented way. And I think that, the beauty of America is its diversity, and almost all of us at some point are the descendants of immigrants. And I want to have a legal immigration system that's going to bring talented workers into the U.S. to start companies, because one of the things that I saw in my business experience is that we were exporting talent. People would come here, they would get a PhD, but then we wouldn't let them stay and start their company here because they didn't meet this or that regulation. If somebody wants to start a company here, I think we should be all over that, right? Like, let's have the growth happen here and not in other countries. And let's engage with Latin America, because I think there's a lot of opportunity there, for us to be competitive in terms of fair trade.
Vladimir Putin would probably question your premise that the next century is going to be about the U.S. and China being superpowers. He's trying to make Russia a superpower again. How should the United States, if it should, counter Russian expansion eastward into Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I think
westward into Europe.
Yeah, I think that we do need to be concerned about Vladimir Putin. I think that he does represent a threat. I don't think Russia as a whole represents the same sort of economic threat and military threat that China does. But I think what we need to do with Putin is we need to, where possible, engage with him. So for example, we've tried to engage with him on Syria. That has not worked so well. But we did work with him on the Iran sanctions that, that basically brought Iran to its knees. So there are common aligned interests with Putin, and we need to work with him on those where we can. But I think that we also need to maintain strong relationships with NATO and the European Union, and be a strong trading partner with them so that they don't become reliant on Russia and therefore have their political interests tied to Putin, because that's not in our best best interest. And I think that given the historical special relationship between NATO and the United States, we're in a strong position to be able to offset his encroachment. I am concerned about Crimea and the Ukraine and the things that he's doing there, but I would support a multilateral approach to that. I don't think that America can be the world's policeman anymore, right? We've tried that. It has failed. We've lost tens of thousands of lives, of our own soldiers as well as of civilians. We have, basically destroyed two countries in Afghanistan and Iraq and then had to rebuild them rather than investing in our own infrastructure. So I want a multilateral approach, similar to when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. It wasn't just the U.S. going in, right? We built a coalition, a true coalition of, states from the primarily Islamic world, states from Europe, and we all worked together to solve that problem. And I think that that's what we need to do. We need to engage with the countries around Russia to work together with them to create a counterbalance to Putin.
Would you vote to give the next president authorization to use military force against ISIS?
I think that the number one responsibility of a member of Congress is to protect America. That is, first and foremost, before we get to anything else, we've got to protect America. I would vote to, without having seen, having any classified briefings or anything like that I would have before I would have to make this vote. But based on what I know right now, I think that, for example, taking out bin Laden was perhaps one of President Obama's greatest successes. He, had attacked America. ISIS has killed Americans. I don't think that we should act unilaterally, but I think if there are opportunities to weaken ISIS, I would approve the president to participate, hopefully in a coalition, but give him or her the power to do so, because I do think protecting America is number one. And, we've seen ISIS infiltrating the U.S., and ISIS is obviously extremely powerful in the Middle East.
How many refugees should the United States accept from Syria while that civil war is going on, and how should we vet them to make sure ISIS isn't slipping in its fighters into that stream?
Yeah, so I don't have a specific number. What I think we need to look at is, let's look at the total number of refugees, let's look at the countries that are willing to accept them, and then let's do a proportional distribution based on that. It's hard to know how long this is going to go on, how many more people will need refugee status. But having lived in Latin America and seen what it can be like to be in a militaristic society or an unstable political situation, I do think that we should do extreme vetting on anyone who comes into this country, but particularly people who come from Syria. So, what I envision is a multi-year vetting process, and we can provide people safe haven, whether it's at a military base in Germany or whether it's, at a sort of reception center in the U.S., but where they're not out into the U.S. population while we go through that vetting. But I would want to make sure that we have, multiple interviews. I'd want to understand who their contacts were. I'd want to look at their electronic communications. I think that there is a long process of vetting that we have to go through. I don't want to make the same mistake that we've made in the past of shutting the door on people when there's a genocide going on. I mean, I consider what's going on in Aleppo a genocide. So I don't want to close the door on people who, the beauty of our country is that we have always taken those who are, in danger or in need, but we can't threaten U.S. security at the same time. So that means a real vetting process with teeth, and that's what I would demand.
What about illegal immigrants in America? You envision a pathway to citizenship or
so
amnesty?
I think that the notion that we're going to go around with ICE forces and take 13 million people out of this country is crazy, right? Like, that's just not going to happen. Plus, our economy in many ways depends on these individuals who take many jobs that other Americans don't want to take. I don't think that anybody should break the law. Okay, I have a legal background. I don't condone in any way breaking the law. At the same time, these individuals are here. Many of them have been here for a long time. So what I would like to see done is that in order for them, and I think a path to permanent residency is probably a better approach rather than a path directly to citizenship, because I think that permanent residence says, okay, you're here, you can stay here, but we're not going to give you 100% of the benefits. We're not going to, for example, let you serve on a jury or vote, et cetera. So we make that distinction. I think that there should be a fine for having come into the country, without proper documentation. And I think that, to the extent that that we can determine any back taxes that might be owed, that should also be paid. But at the end of the day, understanding who's in our country is not just right for those who've been here for 20 years, but it's right for our security, right? I'm not terribly worried about an immigrant who came in, say, from Central America or Mexico for economic reasons. But if we want to know everyone who's in our country, if we want to know are there ISIS members in our country, the only way to do that is to know everyone who's in our country. And so I would rather bring people out of the darkness, get them on a path to what I would propose as permanent residency so that we can have an understanding of who's in our country, right? Because if we don't know who's in our country, even if 99 out of every 100 immigrants who come here in an undocumented fashion do so for economic reasons, then we might miss the one who does so to harm Americans. And so I think it makes sense to have a more sensible policy.
Under President Trump, would you, and assuming you were elected as well, would you support funding for his Great Wall?
I think that the idea of building a wall between us and Mexico, first of all, he claims Mexico is going to pay for it. I don't think that that's pretty, I think that's been dismissed by the Mexican government pretty clearly. He may be a great business deal maker. I'm not so sure about that, but he may be. I don't think he's going to convince Mexico to pay for this wall. I want to fund schools and highways and other infrastructure projects long before I'm going to support a wall. I think we can protect our borders without having to build an enormous wall. And I'm not even sure that an enormous wall is still not going to lead to smuggling of people into the U.S. In fact, what worries me is, enough people die in the desert trying to come through. If next it's going to be putting people in trunks and things like that to try to get them through border crossings, then even more lives are going to be lost. And I just don't think, the message that the wall sends to Latin America, as someone who's spent 4 years living in Latin America, is that we are sort of discounting that part of the world. We're drawing a division, a symbolic division between that part of the world. I think that we need to engage with them. Clearly, immigration is a serious issue, and we need to deal with it in a serious way. And I want people to come to this country in a legal fashion. I just don't think building this wall is the best way to address
Another
that.
hypothetical. You're a former Democrat, you're a former Republican. If you win, who are you going to caucus with?
I am going to caucus with whichever party is in the majority. And if I'm fortunate enough to win a second term and the majority switches, I'm going to switch. And the reason for that is quite clear. It doesn't mean that I don't have principles. Let me be clear about that. I'm very clear about how I'm going to vote on a lot of issues. If you go on my Facebook page, I engage with voters in in-depth discussions of my policy positions, as I do on my website, in a way that Frank Gitza and Carol Shea Porter would never dream of doing. So it's very clear how I'm going to vote, and I'm not going to be influenced by the parties because they don't, they haven't given me any money, they don't have any control over me, and I'm not beholden to them in any way. But my whole campaign is about putting New Hampshire first. And in the House of Representatives, I worked for a Republican member when we were in the majority and when we were in the minority. And when we were in the minority, you couldn't get anything done, right? Because the Rules Committee wouldn't let your bills come to the floor, and unless you could get 218 people to sign on to a petition to bring it straight to the floor, you couldn't get anything done. You had fewer committee assignments. I want to deliver results. My whole life has been about delivering results for students, delivering results in business, delivering results for great nonprofits. If I'm going to deliver the best results for New Hampshire, I need to put myself in the most strategic position that I can. And so by being in the majority, whichever party that may be, and I think that's an open question right now, I will get an extra committee assignment and I will have the ability to get my bills to the floor. And I think that's what people want. They want people who are going to get results, who are going to make their everyday lives better.
Just technically speaking, how do you win this election? Because both parties have all these resources that an independent can't really have. Door knockers, voter lists, all kinds of technical stuff that I think is necessary to win an election. What's your plan to actually get the votes that you need to win?
Yeah, so I think that in one way we have a certain benefit, a couple of benefits. First, I think our message is resonating, right? We are hearing from people every day. We are getting probably 50 to 100 signups on our webpage of people in the district, because we have the zip code there so we can check, of people committing to vote for me. we don't have to worry about having a turnout machine because there's going to be massive turnout this year anyway, right? I mean, it's a presidential year, so it's not like we're running in an off year where you have to turn out your voters. So that turnout machine is not so important. I also think that if you look at how voters are going to vote in this race, Hillary seems to have a lead in the state. It may vary between 2 points and 9 points, but she seems to have a lead. Kelly Ayotte and Maggie Hassan seem to be in a virtual dead heat. Chris Sununu seems to be leading in the governor's race. So by the time people get to U.S. representative, there's a good chance that they will have voted for at least one Republican and one Democrat. Okay? So at that point, people are already in the mind of ticket splitting, and I think that we will be a viable option. And I think that, if all Carol Shea Porter is going to do, and this is all that we've seen her do, is try to hide and hope to ride the Hillary wave, right? I mean, I think that not enough media attention has been drawn to the fact that she is intimidating. For example, I just learned this morning that the Mount Washington Economic Council won't have a debate because she said if I'm there, she won't participate, and Ginta said if I'm not there, she won't participate. Like, candidates shouldn't, I mean, this is exactly what's wrong with the two of them, right? But candidates shouldn't have any say in who's in a debate, right? And so, that means our message is working, and it's getting through, and she's sort of hiding from us. I mean, she sent out a mailer claiming to be this only went to independents, a trusted independent leader for New Hampshire. And so we're fact-checking that, and every day on Facebook we put up another fact that proves she's not independent. She voted with her party 99% of the time. She can't be trusted. She deceived voters for 10 years about her taking PAC money. She's not for New Hampshire, right? She took $11,000 to take a either business class or first class trip to Europe on the dime of a New Hampshire college. I can tell you I'm not going to do that because I know how hard it is for students to pay for college. If I'm going to go to Europe, I'm going to go on my own dime. I'm not going to go on the dime of a college. That's absurd. That's disgusting when we have students, the highest student debt in the nation. So I think our message is resonating. People don't trust Frank Ginta. I think he thinks that he can try to paper over, the finance scandal with a few, relatively small achievements, on many of which he was the co-sponsor, not even the lead sponsor, and try to say that he's serving New Hampshire. That's not going to work. That might have worked in the primary. It barely worked, but it might have worked in the primary where you have very low turnout. People remember your editorial, where Joe McQuaid called him a damn liar. I mean, people remember that, and they're not going to forget that, and we all know about his picadillos. And Carol Shea Porter has run for this seat 6 times, and now she always says, I never have to change my campaign literature. I'm the one for the rest of us. But I guess now that she's made $1 million in Congress, and she's bought a home in a gated yacht club in Florida, she can't say she's one for the rest of us anymore because none of us, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I don't have a house in a gated community in Florida. So, I think that people are sick and tired of these folks, right? Carol has a -5 net favorability. Frank Ginta has a -9 net favorability. I have a +5, and this is before my TV ads went up and my digital campaign went up, a +5 favorability rating. 55% of people in our poll, which was conducted by Mike Berlin, who's worked for both Mike Bloomberg and Hillary Clinton, 55% of voters said that they would consider a viable alternative over the two of them. In a 3-way race, I only need to get 2/3 of those voters because I only need 34% theoretically to win. So, I think, I have about 50% name ID, which is more than any of the gubernatorial candidates except Sununu had going into their primaries. So I feel like, we are in strong shape. We have a professional team. We have professional consultants. I think our TV ad has really pointed out how, Frank Ginta and Carol Shea Porter are just two sides of the same coin. And we're having people come to us from the Republican side, from the Democratic side, and let's not forget that 40% of this district is independent. And if Maine and Vermont and Connecticut can send an independent to the United States Senate, there's no reason that New Hampshire cannot send an independent to Congress.
I think that's a great place to leave it. That's great. Wonderful. I think Grant needs to check on his yacht club in Florida. So
all right. Thank you so much.
Shawn O'Connor, thanks for having us. You'll be on the ballot, and people will also be able to see you and Carol Shea Porter and Frank Ginta. We've invited them to take part in this series too. We haven't had a response from them yet, so
not surprising.
They'll be able to join us.
I hope so.
Well, thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to meet you. Great to see you.